The last thing I felt was the vibration of the platform under my heels. The air at the subway station was always cold, smelling of ozone and damp concrete, but that night, it felt like a tomb. I remembered the weight of the anniversary gift in my bag, a watch I'd spent 6 months saving for to mark 10 years with Logan. Then, I remembered the shove. It wasn't a stranger's hand. It was Logan's. He had looked at me with a terrifying, blank coldness, his fingers still entwined with my younger sister Chloe's. Chloe didn't scream. She didn't try to catch me. She just watched as I tumbled into the dark, toward the two blinding white eyes of the oncoming 6:15 express. "I'm sorry, Harper," Logan had whispered, though he didn't look sorry at all. "But you're just in the way of our future." The screech of the brakes was the last thing I heard. Then, a silence so absolute it felt like being underwater. My eyes snapped open. I wasn't on the tracks. I was in my bed, the high-thread count sheets I'd bought for a master bedroom cool against my skin. The sunlight was streaming through the curtains in soft, dusty ribbons. "Morning, sleepyhead," a voice said. I jolted, my heart hammering against my ribs, so hard it ached. Logan was standing by the closet, buttoning a crisp white shirt. He looked exactly the same, handsome, polished, and perfectly composed. He looked like the man I'd loved for a decade, not the man who had pushed me to my death. "Logan," I croaked, my throat feeling like it was filled with glass. "Happy anniversary, babe," he said, leaning over to kiss my forehead. He smelled of sandalwood and the expensive espresso I bought for him every month. 9 years. Can you believe it? One more to the big decade. I looked at the digital clock on the nightstand. June 14th, 2024. The train station had been June 14th, 2025. I was back. I was exactly 1 year away from the day he and Chloe would kill me. I looked at his hands, the hands that had shoved me, and realized that while he thought he was celebrating a milestone, I was starting a countdown. Breakfast was a masterclass in psychological torture. Logan sat across from me, scrolling through his phone, occasionally looking up to flash me that boyish grin that had once made my heart melt. Now, all I saw was the calculated curve of a predator's mouth. "I was thinking we could do that tasting menu at the Ledger tonight," Logan said, tapping his screen. "You know, to celebrate." "That sounds expensive, Logan," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Didn't you say the firm was tightening the belt this quarter?" In my past life, I would have handed him my credit card and told him not to worry about the cost. I was the high-earning marketing executive. He was the struggling architect who spent more on his wardrobe than on our mortgage. "It's our anniversary, Harper," he said, a slight edge of pouting in his voice. "We deserve to treat ourselves. Besides, I've got that big project coming up. It'll all balance out." It won't, I thought. I knew that project never materialized. I knew he was currently using my business account to fund weekend getaways I wasn't invited to. "I think I'd rather stay in," I said. "I'm not feeling great." Logan's brow furrowed, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face before he smoothed it over with fake concern. "Oh. Well, if that's what you want. I might go into the office for a few hours then, just to clear some paperwork." "Of course," I said. I watched him leave, the front door clicking shut with a finality that made me shiver. I stood up and walked to the window, watching his car pull out of the driveway. He wasn't going to the office. I knew that now. He was going to pick up Chloe. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass. I had 365 days. In the past, I had spent this year being his cheerleader, his bank account, and his emotional rock while he and my sister plotted my unfortunate accident. This year, the rock was going to be the one to crush them. The silence Logan left behind was worse than his presence. In the quiet of our overpriced apartment, I could still hear the phantom screech of metal on metal, the roar of the 6:15 express that had claimed my life in a future that hadn't happened yet. I stood in the center of the living room, my arms wrapped tightly around my ribs, trying to anchor myself to the present. The ozone smell of the subway station seemed to cling to the back of my throat, a ghostly reminder that the man I had just kissed goodbye was a murderer in waiting. I spent the rest of the morning staring at my laptop, but the marketing spreadsheets were a blur of meaningless numbers. My mind was a dizzying loop. The platform, the shove, Logan's cold eyes, Chloe's silent complicity. I was a woman living in a haunted house of her own making. Around noon, a soft, rhythmic knock at the door startled me so violently that I nearly knocked my cold tea across the mahogany desk. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. It was Beckett Vance from 4B. I opened the door slowly. Beckett was leaning against the doorframe, looking exactly like the man I remembered from the periphery of my old life. He was an architect, usually draped in soft, charcoal-colored sweaters with a roll of blueprints tucked under one arm. He had messy dark hair and eyes that always seemed to be searching for the structural integrity of whatever he was looking at. "Hey, Harper," Beckett said, holding out a steaming paper cup from the artisan cafe on the corner. The scent of dark roast and toasted hazelnut cut through the stale air of my apartment. I saw Logan peel out of the parking garage like he was qualifying for NASCAR. You looked like you could use a caffeine hit." I took the cup, the warmth of the cardboard seeping into my perpetually cold fingers. "Thanks, Beckett. You have no idea how much I needed this." "Anniversary jitters?" he asked, his voice low and grounding. He didn't have Logan's practiced, theatrical charm. Beckett spoke with a quiet sincerity that made you want to lean in. "Something like that," I said, taking a sip. The coffee was perfect, exactly how I liked it, with just a splash of oat milk. I looked up at him, realizing for the first time that I'd never told him how I took my coffee. "How did you know it was our anniversary? And how did you know how I like my drink?" Beckett gave a small, slightly embarrassed, crooked smile. "Logan mentioned the anniversary in the elevator 3 days ago. He was bragging about the 5-course tasting menu he'd generously booked. And as for the coffee, I've seen you order it a dozen times when we've been in line together. I'm an architect, Harper. I'm trained to notice the details that make a structure hold up. I don't think I'm holding up very well today," I admitted. The honesty felt like a physical weight leaving my chest. "I can see that," Beckett said. He didn't offer a platitude or a fake "it'll be fine." He just stood there, a solid, unmoving presence in the hallway. "You look like someone who's staring at a blueprint and realizing the foundation is made of sand." I felt a lump form in my throat. He was so close to the truth it was terrifying. In my previous life, Beckett had been the one who brought me coffee after the screaming matches. He was the one who had called the ambulance when I fell down the stairs 6 months before the end. I had been too blinded by my perfect 10-year plan to see that the man who actually cared for me was only 20 feet away. "If you ever need to talk about something other than floor plans or anniversaries," Beckett said, straightening up and preparing to head back to his unit, "I'm right next door. Or if you just need more coffee. I'm basically a barista at this point." "I might take you up on that, Beckett," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "More than you know." "I'm counting on it," he said with a wink before disappearing into 4B. As I closed the door, the fluttering in my chest wasn't fear for the first time in 24 hours. It was a tiny, fragile spark of hope. Logan thought he was the architect of my life, but he was just a squatter. I was going to find a new foundation, and for the first time, I knew exactly where to look. Revenge, I quickly learned, didn't have to be a sudden explosion or a dramatic confrontation in a rain-slicked alleyway. In fact, it was much more satisfying when it was a whisper, a slow, methodical draining of the lifeblood Logan had pumped from me for a decade. In my past life, I had been his atmospheric pressure, the constant force that kept his world stable and inflated. Without me, he was going to collapse, and I intended to watch every agonizing second of the deflation. It started with the financial correction. One Tuesday evening, Logan came home and tossed a glossy brochure for a high-end Italian sports car onto the kitchen island. "The firm is close to closing the Miller account, Harper," he said, his eyes bright with the greed I had once mistaken for ambition. I was thinking this would be the perfect way to celebrate our 10th next year. A little upgrade for the garage. In the past, I would have smiled, looked at our savings, and figured out how to make it happen. Tonight, I didn't even look at the brochure. I continued chopping vegetables for a salad only for myself. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Logan," I said, my voice as flat as the counter. I've moved the majority of the liquid assets into a long-term, high-yield trust. It's locked for the next 5 years. And I've switched my payroll to a private account. The joint account is only for the mortgage and basic utilities from now on. Logan froze, the brochure sliding an inch across the marble. You did what? Without talking to me. I thought you'd be happy, I said, finally meeting his gaze with a look of feigned innocence. You're always saying we need to be more financially responsible. Since your architectural commissions have been, well, non-existent lately, I figured I should take the lead. You understand, right? The vein in his temple began to throb, a telltale sign of his mounting fury. But what about my expenses? My memberships? My club dues? Maybe you could ask Chloe for a loan? I suggested, watching his face turn a fascinating shade of gray. She's always talking about how well her influencer career is going. Surely, she can help her favorite brother-in-law. He didn't have an answer for that. He just turned and stormed into his study, slamming the door. I felt a cold, jagged sense of triumph. Every dollar I withheld was a dinner he couldn't buy Chloe, a weekend getaway he couldn't fund, and a piece of the perfect life he was trying to build on my bones. But the house felt suffocating after that. I grabbed my tablet and headed next door. Beckett's apartment was the polar opposite of mine. Where my home was filled with the expensive, soulless furniture Logan had insisted on, Beckett's place was a sanctuary of warm wood, overflowing bookshelves, and the faint, pleasant scent of sawdust and ink. He was hunched over a massive drafting table when I walked in, the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminating a complex blueprint. Rough night at the office? Beckett asked, not looking up but pulling out the stool next to him. Rough night at the foundation, I said, sitting down. I watched him work for a moment, the steady, rhythmic scratch of his pencil a soothing contrast to Logan's erratic temper. What are you building? A library for a community center downtown, Beckett said, finally looking at me. His eyes were tired but kind. Something that's meant to last. Something that people can actually rely on. I spent the next 2 hours in his office, helping him cross-reference building codes. For the first time in years, I wasn't an emotional crutch or a bank account. I was a partner. We talked about structural integrity, about the way light should fall in a room to make it feel safe, and about the things in life that were worth saving. You're very good at this, Harper, Beckett said as I prepared to leave. He reached out, his hand briefly touching my arm. You have a mind for the way things fit together. Don't let anyone convince you that you're just the interior decorator of your own life. I went back to my apartment feeling taller. Logan was waiting for me in the dark of the living room, his phone screen glowing as he frantically messaged someone, no doubt Chloe, complaining about the sudden change in his wife. I didn't say a word. I just walked past him, a ghost in my own home, knowing that the bleed had begun and there was no way for him to stop the leak. 6 months into my new life, the air in the apartment felt like a simmering pot about to boil over. Logan was a ghost of his former arrogant self, his pride wounded by the financial setbacks I'd manufactured. It was into this tension that my younger sister, Chloe, decided to make her grand entrance. In my past life, I had adored her. I had seen her as the fragile, artistic soul who just needed a little help finding her way. I'd given her my designer hand-me-downs, paid her security deposits, and let her treat our guest room like a revolving door. I'd been the perfect bridge for her to walk all over. The doorbell rang, and there she was, wearing a silk scarf and a pout that had always worked on me before. She smelled of the expensive, cloying lily-of-the-valley perfume that Logan used to buy for her with my credit card. Harper, I missed you so much, Chloe said, throwing her arms around me. I felt a jolt of pure, visceral revulsion. My skin crawled where her hands touched my shoulders, the same hands that had stood by and watched me tumble toward the screeching metal of a subway train. I forced myself to remain still, my heart a cold stone in my chest. You look tired, Chloe, I said, pulling back and leading her into the living room. Is everything okay? Oh, life is just so hard lately, she said, flopping onto my velvet sofa and looking around the room with a practiced greed. She noticed the lack of new decorations, the missing high-end speakers Logan had been eyeing. I was actually hoping maybe you and Logan could help me out. Just a small loan for my car insurance? My agent is being such a jerk. Logan walked into the room then, his eyes lighting up when they landed on Chloe. He looked at me, his expression full of that old, manipulative hope. Harper, we can help her out, right? She's family. I sat down in the armchair, crossing my legs and looking from one to the other. I'm so glad you brought that up, Chloe, because I was actually going to ask if you could lend us some money this month. The silence that followed was deafening. Chloe's sweet little sister, mask didn't just slip, it cracked down the middle.
What?
You're joking, right? She said, her voice rising an octave. I wish I were, I said, sighing dramatically. Logan, honey, did you tell her? The architectural firm has completely stalled. Between his lack of commissions and the new tax bracket I've moved into, we're actually thinking of selling the apartment and moving into a studio across town. I was hoping you could take us in for a few weeks while we look for something affordable. Logan's face turned a deep, humiliated shade of purple. Harper, we don't need to talk about that right now, he said, his voice through gritted teeth. But we do, Logan, I said, leaning forward. Chloe needs to know that the bank is closed. In fact, Chloe, I was thinking you could sell that designer bag Logan gave you for your birthday. The resale value on that could probably cover our mortgage for a month. Chloe looked at Logan, and for the first time in this life, I saw the seeds of resentment I had planted begin to sprout. She didn't see a powerful man she could steal. She saw a sinking ship. You said you had everything under control, Logan, Chloe said, her voice sharp and devoid of its usual sweetness. I do. Logan snapped. Harper is just being dramatic. I'm being realistic, I said, standing up. Logan, if you can't provide for your own sister-in-law, how are you going to provide for us? Maybe Chloe's roommates have a spare couch for you. I watched them exchange a look, not of secret lovers, but of two predators realizing there was no meat left on the bone. Chloe didn't stay for dinner. She left in a huff, her heels clicking angrily against the hardwood. Logan spent the night on the sofa, and I spent the night in my room, smiling at the ceiling. The wedge was driven. Now, all I had to do was wait for the split. I didn't have to wait until the 10th anniversary this time. By the 9th month, the house of cards I'd spent nearly a year destabilizing was ready to collapse with a single breath. The lack of fun money had turned Logan and Chloe's secret romance into a bitter struggle for survival. They were hungry, they were desperate, and most importantly, they were sloppy. I told Logan I was heading to Chicago for a weekend leadership conference. I even went as far as packing a suitcase with my best blazers and showing him a forged flight confirmation on my phone. I'll miss you, babe, Logan said, leaning against the doorframe of our bedroom. He tried to look sincere, but his eyes were darting toward his own phone, likely timing how long it would take for Chloe to get here after my Uber pulled away. Take some time for yourself, too. You've been so stressed lately. I plan to, I said, a small, private smile playing on my lips. I'm going to find a lot of clarity this weekend. I didn't go to the airport. I went exactly 20 feet down the hallway to apartment 4B. Beckett was waiting for me with a glass of wine and a quiet, steady presence that made the madness of my plan feel like unnecessary surgery. He knew about the affair now. I'd shared the suspicions I had cultivated over months. You don't have to go back in there tonight, Harper, Beckett said, his voice low as we sat in the dim light of his living room. The evidence you've gathered already, the bank statements, the texts, it's enough for any divorce lawyer. I need to see it, Beckett, I said, my hand trembling slightly as I set my glass down. I need the final, undeniable proof that the people I loved most in the world would trade my life for a piece of equity. We waited until 11:30 p.m. The building was silent, but through the thin walls, I could hear the faint, muffled sound of music coming from my own unit. I stood up, my heart a cold, hard knot in my chest. I'll be right here, Beckett said, standing at his door. If you need me, just shout. I used my key to quietly enter my apartment. The foyer was dark, but a trail of clothes, Chloe's silk scarf, Logan's designer tie, led like a path of breadcrumbs straight to the master bedroom. I could hear them laughing. Chloe's high-pitched, girlish giggle vibrated through the air, followed by the clink of wine glasses. My wine. I stood at the door for a moment listening. When do you think she'll actually file the papers? Chloe asked, her voice muffled by the pillows. I'm sick of hiding in this guest room every time she comes home early. As soon as I can convince her that the downsizing is her idea, Logan said. I could hear the smirk in his voice. Once we sell this place and I get my half of the equity, we're out of here. She's just a paycheck, Chloe. She's always been a means to an end. She's so boring, Chloe complained. I don't know how you stood 10 years with her. She's like a robot. I reached out and flipped the light switch, flooded the room with a harsh, unforgiving glare. The scream Chloe let out was a jagged, ugly sound that tore through the quiet night. Logan scrambled to pull the duvet over himself, his face draining of color until he looked like a ghost. Harper, you're supposed to be in Chicago. Logan stammered, his eyes wide with a panicked, animalistic fear. And you were supposed to be a husband, I said, my voice eerily calm. I walked to the dresser and picked up the small, innocuous alarm clock I'd placed there weeks ago. I turned it around, revealing the tiny, blinking red light of a hidden camera. But it turns out, you're just a squatter. Get out. Both of you. Right now. Harper, wait. I can explain. Logan yelled, reaching out toward me. Explain what, Logan? I asked, stepping back. That I'm just a paycheck? That you've been waiting for me to be out of the way? I've seen enough. The locks are being changed in the morning, and my lawyer has the footage. You have 10 minutes to take what you can carry. You can't do this, Harper. This is half mine. Logan's voice had lost its smooth, architectural precision. It was shrill, echoing off the high ceilings of the bedroom I had meticulously decorated with my own bonuses. He stood there, wrapped in a duvet like a pathetic caricature of the man who had once been my entire world. Actually, Logan, I said, tossing a heavy manila folder onto the foot of the bed, I can. This is a copy of the prenuptial agreement you signed 10 years ago, alongside the recent amendments regarding infidelity and financial abuse. But more importantly, I've already filed for an emergency restraining order based on the threats caught on that camera. The mortgage is in my name. The down payment was my inheritance. You are a guest who has overstayed his welcome. Chloe was sobbing now, that performative, hitching breath she used to get our father to buy her toys when we were children. Harper, please. He told me you two were over. He said you were seeing someone else. Save the breath, Chloe, I said, looking at her with a detached kind of pity. I heard you call me a robot 10 minutes ago. I heard you call me a paycheck. You didn't want him. You wanted my life. Well, congratulations. You can have the version of him that has no credit, no house, and no one left to lie to. Watching them scramble was the most cathartic experience of my 2 lives. Logan tried to grab his designer watches from the dresser, but I stood in his way. Those were gifts from me, Logan. Provenance is everything in a divorce. Leave them. He looked like he wanted to strike me. For a second, I saw that flash of darkness in his eyes, the same look he'd had on the subway platform. But I wasn't alone this time. The door opened, and Beckett stood there, his presence filling the hallway, silent and immovable. Logan saw him and withered. He knew he was outnumbered and outmatched. They left 20 minutes later, carrying their belongings in black plastic trash bags. It was a fitting image. The 2 people who had trashed my soul were leaving like the garbage they were. As the front door clicked shut, the silence that followed wasn't heavy or terrifying. It was clean. I walked through the apartment, opening the windows to let out the scent of Chloe's perfume and Logan's sandalwood. I wanted the city air to scrub the rooms. Are you okay? Beckett asked, stepping into the living room. He didn't rush to hug me. He gave me space to breathe in my own victory. I'm more than okay, I said, turning to him. I feel like I've finally stopped falling. What's the next move? He asked. I'm selling this place, I said firmly. I don't want to live in a mausoleum of my past mistakes. I want something smaller, something with a better view of the future. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal filings and estate agents. Logan tried to fight me, sending desperate, rambling emails that shifted from, "I love you," to "I'll ruin you" within hours. I blocked him. Chloe tried to call our mother, but I had already sent the video to the family group chat. The bridge wasn't just burned, it was vaporized. I moved out on a rainy Tuesday. Beckett helped me carry the last of the boxes. As we stood in the empty foyer, I looked at the spot where I had once stood on my 9th anniversary, terrified and broken. "Ready to go home?" Beckett asked, holding out his hand. "Yes," I said, taking it. His grip was warm and real. We didn't go far, just down the hall to his place while my new apartment was being readied. But as we walked past the elevator, I realized I wasn't looking over my shoulder anymore. The train was gone, and I was finally standing on solid ground. June 14th. For 2 lifetimes, this date had been a dark specter looming on my calendar. In one life, it was the day I was shoved into the abyss. In another, it was the day I began a desperate, year-long chess match for my survival. But as I woke up this morning, the sun hitting the soft linen of my new bedroom, I realized something profound. The day had lost its power over me. The air didn't smell like ozone or damp concrete. It smelled like the fresh lavender on my nightstand and the faint, comforting aroma of dark roast coffee wafting from the kitchen. I walked into the living space of the new apartment I'd bought, a sun-drenched loft with high ceilings and a view of the park, not the train tracks. Beckett was there, standing at the kitchen island. He wasn't scrolling through a phone or calculating his next move. He was just waiting for me. "Happy June 14th, Beckett said, sliding a ceramic mug across the counter toward me. He watched my face closely, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding of what this day represented. "How are you feeling?" "Light," I said, taking a sip of the coffee. It was, as always, perfect. "I thought I'd be bracing for impact today, but the ground feels solid." "That's because you built it that way, Harper," Beckett said. He walked around the counter and took my hand. "You're the one who fixed the foundation. I just provided the coffee while you worked." "You did a lot more than that, Beckett," I said, leaning into him. Later that afternoon, I found myself, by choice, not by force, standing at the very subway station where I had once died. I wasn't there to catch a train. I was there to meet a friend for lunch nearby. I stood behind the yellow line, watching the 6:15 express roar into the station. The wind whipped my hair across my face, and the screech of the metal was deafening. But when the train passed and the air settled, I didn't feel a hand on my back. I felt only the warmth of the sun coming through the street-level grates. As I climbed the stairs back to the street, I saw 2 figures huddled near a bus stop across the way. I stopped, my breath catching for only a second. It was Logan and Chloe. A year of living in the reality they had created for themselves had not been kind. Logan's expensive white shirt was gone, replaced by a cheap, wrinkled polo. He looked older, his face etched with the bitter lines of someone who had spent 12 months blaming the world for his own failures. Chloe stood beside him, clutching a knockoff handbag, her face twisted in a familiar, sharp-edged pout as she shouted something at him. "I told you the bus was at 6. Chloe yelled, her voice carrying over the traffic. "You can't even get a schedule right, Logan. How are we supposed to get to my mother's?" "Maybe if you hadn't spent the utility money on that fake tan, we'd have a car, Chloe." Logan barked back, his voice full of the same vitriol he used to save for me. They looked miserable. They looked trapped. Their perfect future had turned out to be a cramped apartment and a shared bank account that was perpetually overdrawn. Without my light to steal, they were just 2 shadows feeding on each other. Logan looked up then and caught my eye. For a moment, time seemed to stop. I saw the flash of recognition in his eyes, followed by a surge of desperate, pathetic hope. He started to take a step toward me. "Harper," he croaked. I didn't say a word. I didn't sneer, and I didn't yell. I simply adjusted my bag, gave him a small, polite nod, the kind you give a stranger you've lost interest in, and turned away. Beckett was waiting for me at the corner, leaning against a lamp post. He saw me approaching, and a bright, genuine smile broke across his face. "Everything okay?" he asked as I reached him. Everything is perfect, I said, slipping my hand into his. I didn't look back. I had spent 10 years building a life for a man who wanted me dead, and 1 year fighting to stay alive. Now, for the first time, I was simply living. As we walked down the street, away from the station and into the bright afternoon light, I realized that the best revenge wasn't the downfall of my enemies. It was the fact that I had forgotten they even existed.